I've been thinking about this, and I think the biggest myth in scholarly publishing is that scholarly publishing is as easy as it looks. I've heard many people who are critical of scholarly publishers think that what we do is we take PDFs from scientists and basically stick them on a website. And we do so much more than that. There is a very good essay written by an industry legend called Ken Anderson, where he goes through and details things that publishers do, from making sure, scholarly publishers making sure that content is reliable and as correct as possible through discoverables, so that it creates tools so that you can find pieces of information, makes it searchable, makes it reproducible, archives the information so it's around for essentially forever, and reads the trends of the publishing landscape, accommodates new models like open access, is able to disseminate that information to the widest possible audience. And so there are just so many things that scholarly publishers do.
Hey everyone, this is Devin Miller here with another episode of The Inventive Expert. I'm your host, Devin Miller, the serial entrepreneur that's grown several startups into 7- and 8-figure businesses, as well as the founder and CEO of Miller IP Law, where he helps startups and small businesses with their patents and trademarks. You ever need help with yours, just go to strategymeeting.com, grab some time with us to chat, and we're always here to help. Now, on today's episode, we have Matthew Salter. And Matthew, we're going to be talking about a few different things, primarily with the publishing industry and some of the changes that have taken place over the last decade or so, and also talking a little bit about what should be open to the public and what you should pay for, and maybe talk a little bit about the rise of self-publishing and also subscription publishing versus open publishing, and impact of AI on scholarly papers, and a little bit of integrity and ethics with publishing. So should be a great discussion, a lot of good areas to learn from. And with that much as an introduction, welcome on the podcast, Matthew.
Hi, Devin. It's great to be back.
Absolutely. And for those that didn't catch, Matthew was a guest on our sister podcast, The Inventive Journey. So if you haven't had a chance to go check out Matthew's full journey, definitely encourage you to go check him out there. But for those people that haven't had a chance to check out that Inventive Journey episode yet, take a minute or two and introduce yourself to the audience.
Yeah, thank you, Devin. So as I said, it's a great pleasure to be back on. So my name is Matthew Salter, and I am the founder and CEO of a company called Akabana Consulting. You can see our logo behind me. Akabana means a red flower in Japanese. I've had a long association with Japan, but I'm happily resident here, have been for the last 7+ years in Maryland, USA. Originally, I'm from the UK, as you can probably tell. And Akabana Consulting is a boutique publishing consultancy that offers advice on publishing, research ethics, business development, and a whole host of other services to publishers and learned societies, people in the learned and scholarly publishing space. And so I'm really excited about what we're going to talk about today. My little bit of my background, as I said, I was born in the United Kingdom, but I've moved and lived in 5 countries, including, of course, now America, and previous to that, Japan, where I spent altogether around 12 years living and working, and in other countries in Europe earlier in my life. So as I said, great pleasure to be back on the podcast, and happy to looking forward to getting into today's subjects.
Awesome. No, that was a great introduction. Definitely looking forward to chatting with you on a myriad of topics with the publishing industry. But maybe to kick things off, one of the things that we chatted a bit before the podcast was, the evolution or the changes that have taken place over the last decade with the publishing industry. So maybe give us a bit of an intro. How has the publishing industry changed over the last decade, and kind of where's it at today?
Yeah, that's a really important question, Devin, because, I think scholarly publishing has changed so much over certainly the last 10 years, but even over the last 15, 20 years as well. Originally, I was a researcher in chemistry. For the first kind of iteration of my life, I was a researcher in the universities in the UK and Japan. And back in the day when I first started, scholarly publishing and how researchers accessed the output of scholarly publishing was to go down to a big library full of dusty journals and books and lift big books off the shelves and take them to a table and start, flipping pages till you found the articles you wanted. Of course, this was pre-internet days, so that kind of dates me a little bit, but it meant that, you had to go out and find that information. It was difficult to search. As I say, after a day in the library, you've done pretty much a workout and you felt physically tired after lugging all those books around. Then, of course, the internet revolution came, everything went online. And now, of course, we have instant access to thousands and thousands of journals, ability to search content, mine content, reuse content, put content up on social media, which, of course, certainly in the last 15 years has been a big change. And so I think, for everyone's lives have been revolutionized by that, but none more than scholarly publishing. And we have a situation really where probably the biggest development in the last 10 to 15 years, following on from the online revolution, is the rise of a publishing model, which you alluded to in your introduction, Devin, called open access publishing. And there's something that's close to it, which we refer to as public access as well. So that's a slightly different thing, but related. And just for your viewers, just for those people who are not familiar with this, and maybe there are some people who have used scholarly publications in the past when they were at college. In a conventional model for scholarly publishing, journals and books will be published by companies, and those access to those publications will be sold to libraries and institutions around the world. So your university library, college libraries, government departments, research facilities, and so on. And back in the day, of course, that meant sending out printed copies, which would get put on shelves. But of course, now it's all online. And so people access that material through their laptop or computer in wherever they study or work. But traditionally, the way that was sold was publishers would work with libraries and library consortia to sell subscriptions, online subscriptions that allowed people within that institution to access the content for which they're paid. Now, that meant, of course, that you had to be working in one of those institutions and that access had to be paid. Typically, it was institutional level. Very few people purchased private access to these packages. And as things evolved, publishers would sell not just one journal or two journals, but huge packages of journals, sometimes hundreds of journals together in a group. You can think of when you buy various packages online to access content on Netflix or some similar provider, you tend to buy into a package of things, and that's how it worked there. So that worked for a long while, but a criticism of that model was that you had to kind of be on site in a library and to be able to view that. Now, there are ways around that, of course, technologically, so that researchers can be somewhere off-site. They can be in an airport, going between to conferences. They could be working from a coffee shop and so on and so forth. But around in the early 2000s, a group of publishers and a group of solid communications people got together, and they thought about how it would be easier and a way that you could get that information out to a wider audience, and particularly audience of not just people who worked in institutions and did scholarly works. And so they came up with an idea called open access. And what that means is that instead of the reader paying to read content, so instead of libraries working and paying publishers to be able to access that content, then the institution or the researcher who published that content would pay a fee to publish that content. Now, the content has to be peer reviewed. That means it has to be checked by experts to make sure that it's accurate and correct. So, of course, it's not just people paying money to publish any old thing, at least not in the scholarly publishing world. But instead of access through a subscription, people would start paying access fees, so typically known as article processing charges, or APCs. And so a large proportion of publishing is now going in that way. And what that means simply for the consumer is that they don't need to be an institution. They don't need to have paid a subscription. They can click on to an article that's made open access, and they can read that wherever they like, whenever they like. And that's been a huge change.
Interesting shift in kind of how the direction things have taken. Now, the question always becomes, or at least in my mind, is, hey, if I'm not paying for something and I'm getting it for free, so to speak, or getting that open access, somebody has to make money along the way in order for it to make sense for them, and that's kind of the model of, sometimes it is pop-up ads on websites, or it is commercials on television, or it is data mining for Facebook and and then provide or presenting ads, or myriad of ways. But as as they're shifting to more of that open access model, so that people can access these scholarly papers without having to pay that large upfront fee, especially if they're not sure if it or how applicable the paper is, where does that kind of or income stream come from that still makes it possible to pay for it all?
Yeah, so I mean, so obviously income and the way that business model, the change in that business model has actually changed behavior in scholarly publishing is the key question, Devin. I think you've really put your finger on it there. So under the open access model, payment is made to the publisher from the institution or the authors who have written the paper. So in order to make that available open, they will pay a fee, and the fee can range anywhere from $1,000 to $1,500 up to several $1,000s per paper, depending really on how selective the journal is, i.e. how what percentage of the submissions the journal receives it actually publishes. One thing that's really important about an open access model is that it's a model that works well on volume publishing. So essentially, the more you publish, the more you receive in fees, and that's led some people to be concerned about that part of scholarly publishing, that having a deleterious effect on the quality of scholarly publishing, because essentially you can think that unscrupulous providers, and there are a number of them in the world, we call them predatory publishers, would just take your money for anything and just put it up and publish it and do no vetting or checking of that material to ensure its quality or its accuracy, and would just take your money and run. Now, reputable publishers don't do that. But what they have to do is make sure that they can cover their costs and make a reasonable profit on above that, so that they can keep their businesses going. And depending on how big a margin or how selective a journal is, that APC can vary. So I'll give you, for example, if a journal has an accept rate of 10%, it means that for every 10 articles that they receive to consider for publication, they publish one, which means they have to review 10 to find one article they want to publish, and only one of those articles can they charge a fee for. So all the expense of looking at all of the other articles has to be covered in the cost they get for the one article that they publish. And so you can quite quickly see that, particularly if you are accepting more and more papers, and that means you're publishing a journal that has a higher accept rate, that is something that allows you either to make more money or to reduce the APC, because you're getting more units which are actually bringing in a revenue. And so that's had profound implications for processes, for the kind of philosophy around publishing, and also brought a number of unintended consequences into the publishing model. And so dealing with those things and making sure that the content that's published is of high quality, whilst also making it accessible, has been a real challenge for publishers and institutions and authors, certainly over the last 10 and maybe 15 years.
No, makes sense, and sounds like a great evolution. Now, one maybe follow-up question or to that, maybe shifting gears just a little bit, but I think along those same lines is, one of the things that you've seen, I think in general with a lot of I've seen a lot of times, not necessarily always in academic papers, but is the rise of self-publishing. So in other words, you get on, a lot of people, they want to write a book, they want to do something else. And if it's a fictional book or an autobiography, you can go through the arduous process of trying to find a publisher and getting someone that will pay for that. And there's benefits to that, and it can hit a broader market. But a lot of times, Amazon's made it pretty simple. You can go on there, you can put your book on there, they'll self-publish, they'll even provide printing services, and it makes it accessible to a lot of people that otherwise wouldn't necessarily be able to approach the publishing realm. Have you seen that or any self-publishing impact the academic world, or is there any shift or trend away towards it or away from it, or no real impact on that?
Well, so self-publishing in terms of publishing PhD theses and things which are not peer-reviewed is a small element of what happens in scholarly publishing. But the kind of difference between commercial publishing, or I should say trade publishing, so publishing novels, for example, or even non-fiction books, is that those books get edited, or if you're self-publishing, of course, you edit it yourself. But the difference between scholarly publishing and other types of publishing is, to the most extent, to almost exclusively, the content is peer-reviewed, which means that it is checked by your peers. So, for instance, when I was an active researcher, I would work with my colleagues and my supervisor, my professor, or when I was a professor with my students, and we would write a paper that described some research findings we had. We included data along with that. We included other material that was useful for that paper, and we would submit it to a publishing company, a scholarly publisher. And what they do is they receive that manuscript, they decide whether they want to review it, and if they want to review it, they will send it to experts in the field. They will ask those experts in the field, is this correct? Does the paper support and the data? Does the paper support the findings? Is the data correct, and is it correctly explained? Do you believe it? Is it plausible? Does it conform to what we know about science? And those experts, those peer reviewers, and sometimes I've done peer reviewing as well as an expert reviewer, and they will look at those and they will go through and they will check it, and they will make comments such as, typically there are always some criticisms and some suggestions for improving that manuscript. It may be you need to write this more carefully, or you would need to do some more experiments, or it would be useful if you included something about this. And those comments come back. The author takes those on board and maybe does more experiments or rewrites part of it. And this cycle turns over until the reviewers are satisfied and they say, okay, we think you can publish this. So it's it goes through a critical process before it gets published. Whereas if you self-publish and put it on Amazon, essentially that review is done by whether people actually buy your book or not. And typically with a novel, if you write a novel that's not very good, people are not going to read it. On the other hand, if you write a paper about a new potential therapy, a medical therapy, it needs to be very rigorously checked, because if it's wrong, people could get harmed. Or it could, even if it's not a medical publication, if you put something into the literature which isn't true or isn't correct, with no sort of outside checking of that, it's a bad thing, because the scholarly literature has some incorrect information, and despite the best efforts of journals, incorrect information does get through, and then sometimes it has to be retracted or corrected later on. But that's a sign really of the process of scholarly publishing going correctly. Even when there are some mistakes that slip through the net first time round, it's there's always a hunt on to make sure they're corrected as far as possible.
Now, let me just ask, is this is a world we're a little bit familiar but not very familiar with. Now, going back to maybe the initial question, which was on self-publishing, it sounds like, or to read between the lines, and kind of take what you said, benefits of going through with the academic paper, of going through with it and having it published and going through all of those, is you're going to have peer review. Meets a higher level of likely being accurate and true, and and shows that. Now, if you were to, in the other situation, let's say your university or the publisher or whoever was just says, hey, we don't want to do this, or it doesn't make sense, and whether it's because they don't think it's accurate, or it's not going to be as profitable or well received, or it's too narrow, or that, is there an avenue to go to self-publishing and still have some of that rigor? So still have it peer reviewed, still have it do it? Or is there other avenues that, if you can't get the publishers to pick it up, that if you have what you consider to be a good academic paper, is there other avenues to still get that out there?
So that's actually goes to a really important current question in publishing now. So typically, the drivers for doing self-publishing, for example, in trade publishing, so writing novels or other books, is different to that of scholarly publishing. In scholarly publishing, scientists and researchers are trying to discover new things or propose new theories, and that's because they want to discover new things and adumbrate that knowledge for people and publicize that. They do it for their own careers too, because as scientists, that's their job to discover new things, or not just scientists, social scientists too, and humanities researchers as well. And so that the reward that they get for that is in the long run promotion, tenure at universities, increase their reputation. So typically, it's not a financial drive for people. Of course, people like to get paid properly and so on and so forth. But it's not really about trying to sell your manuscript. It's to build up a portfolio of work to improve your reputation, so that you can get promoted, so that you can get permanent positions at universities and advance your career in that way. But the question you asked about whether you can actually put things out into the scholarly literature without peer review is a very interesting one. Stuff that isn't peer reviewed generally tends to be less well regarded than things that have been peer reviewed. And of course, there's every manuscript starts off as being non-peer reviewed until it ends up peer reviewed. But what a group of people and a trend in academic publishing now is to say, well, it would be good for scientists before this thing has actually been peer reviewed and published in a journal, which can take a period of time. In some fields, it would be really good to get an early look at that before it goes through that process, so we can just see what the ideas are. So, for example, a perfect example recently was during COVID, when a lot of people, a huge number of people around the world were researching COVID and therapies and all the things to do with COVID. And people were saying, if we could get that information before it has to go through the whole process of being peer reviewed, maybe we could get a jump on the virus. And that's happened for a whole bunch of different reasons, a lot of them to do with medical situations. So what people do in those cases is there are things called preprints, which essentially is a rough draft or a good draft, but an unpeer reviewed draft of the article you want to submit. And there are many now what are called preprint servers, which are essentially electronic repositories where people put up papers which they're intending to submit later to a journal, but which haven't actually received the peer review and then been published. But people can go in and look at those and say, we're getting a kind of an early kind of sneak preview of what's going to appear in the journal. And the idea behind that is to speed up discovery of new technologies, new therapies, new materials, whatever it might be. That sounds really good. The kind of controversy with that is peer review is supposed to be there to try to weed out as many mistakes or irregularities or things which aren't supported by data as possible. And of course, if you look at a preprint, none of that has happened. Now, for a majority of preprints, most of them are okay, and they will probably at some point pass peer review. But because there's been no expert scrutiny at that point, experts can make a decision about whether that research is valid or not. But others who are not so expert in that field might not be able to make that judgment. And a particular concern is where, for example, just this week, there was a preprint around room temperature superconductivity, which just this week has turned out actually not to be correct. No one was lying. It's just it wasn't what people thought. But it was already making a big splash in the media because many of the media companies, newspapers, and so on and so forth don't have the ability to discern between what is correct and what is probably not correct or not what it seems. And so there is a big concern about particularly things like COVID, which was a very controversial topic and of course which affected a lot of people. There is a concern about how that kind of unregulated publishing of scientific information can better be regulated. So there is a kind of concern and a degree of controversy around preprints. However, they are multiplying, they're extremely popular. And in some disciplines, for example, high energy physics, they've been around for decades. The first online repository for preprints was launched in 1991. So they've been around for 30 plus years in that case. And more disciplines are starting to use preprint servers.
No, it makes sense. And sounds like continual evolution. The preprint service gives an opportunity to maybe catch things before they go out into the public or hit the mainstream, so to speak. Now, I think one other topic that we talked on, and we're already getting towards the end of the podcast and have so many more things we could talk about, but I think one that seems to be at least more in the news or relevance or whatever you want to call it is the impact of AI on scholarly publishing. In other words, hey, if I can go and have AI that's properly trained or otherwise, set up correct, that it can go and get a lot of these citations, a lot of the information, aggregate it and culminate it together and either get a reasonable paper, whether it's a draft or maybe the final thing, and I don't know, but seems like that's an option or maybe a tool or maybe a replacement depending on where it goes for all of these. But I'd love to get your thoughts on kind of the impact of AI as it has been hitting the scholarly publishing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so really, I was recently at probably the biggest international conference of scholarly publishers earlier this year in Portland, Oregon. It's an annual conference, and that was the topic that was literally on everyone's lips. I mean, it really dates back to for scholarly publishing back to last November when ChatGPT came out. These LLMs, these large learning model driven tools for generating content. It's called generative AI in our business, generating content from sourcing related content from all across the web from various different publication sources and synthesizing them into another document. That is starting to have and will doubtless have a bigger and bigger impact on scholarly publishing. And where we're really seeing challenges in scholarly publishing is kind of keeping up policy and practices and protocols and the law, in fact, and keeping up with technology, because there are a number of questions that generative AI poses for the scholarly publishing industry. There are many for society in general, but in the context of our conversation, here's for instance, if you use something like ChatGPT or another LLM resource to generate content that you use in a paper, is that allowable? Can you actually have an artificial intelligence tool as one of the authors on a scholarly paper? So that's really a philosophical question. Most publishers at the moment say, no, you can't do that, because authors on a scholarly paper, have to be able to take responsibility for what they've written and be accountable for it. And a machine can't be accountable for what it does. So that's a policy decision that has to be made. In terms of fears about how it could affect the content and the quality of the content. One thing that AI model, generative AI tools can't do is they can't make a value judgment about whether a source is reliable or not, whether it's plausible or not, in the same way that a human expert could do. You can find papers in the literature which you think are very good, are very good, and others which are more suspect. But AI generators at the moment can't make that kind of decision, and so they just synthesize everything that looks relevant and put it into a document. And that can be very potentially dangerous if they're bringing in information which is later found out to be not relevant or not reliable. And so that's a big worry for publishers. And simply also things around the law and around copyright. Who owns copyright if it's generated by an AI generator? The Research Service of Congress recently said that, came out with a report that said that AI generated content, you can't hold copyright in it. And I'll leave you with one. So there are a lot of issues which the publishing industry are still running to catch up with. Watch this space, because it's certainly not something that's going to be decided in the next few days or weeks. We're going to be talking about this for months and years to come. And I'll leave you with one example, which I saw on social media just this week. A well-known author who writes kind of self-help books and advisory books and around business and so on, found that somebody had used her works and put them through a generative AI tool and generated derivative works, put them on Goodreads and Amazon using her name. And she found them, and she had no idea that they existed. And when she tried to have them removed, initially, although now happily it's been resolved, initially there was a question mark over whether she could do that, because she didn't hold the copyright in the derived article, even though it was her original, perfectly, properly published original material that had been used. So happily for her, that turned out okay. But it's just an example of technology getting ahead of where the law is. So it's a massive, massive challenge. The other thing I'd like to say before we finish is I do believe that there are some potentially, positive uses for generative AI in scholarly publishing. So we need to find out how we can use the good parts of that, but make sure that we understand and have good solutions for when unintended consequences crop up that we need to deal with. And it's absolutely, you put your finger right on the most hot button topic in scholarly publishing as of the 10th of August, 2023.
Well, fair enough. Well, sounds like a lot of things going on, a lot of interesting things and forcing and causing the industry to continue to evolve. So sounds like a fun area to keep an eye on. So with that, now we're already running towards the end of the episode and feel like there's a lot of things that we can still chat on. So we'll have to have you back maybe on a future episode or a sister podcast. But for today, I always like to wrap up each episode with the same last question. So we'll jump to that now, which is within your industry, what is the biggest myth and why is it wrong?
That's a really good one. I've been thinking about this, and I think the biggest myth in scholarly publishing is that scholarly publishing is as easy as it looks. I've heard many people who are critical of scholarly publishers think that what we do is we take PDFs from scientists and basically stick them on a website. And we do so much more than that. There is a very good essay written by an industry legend called Ken Anderson, where he goes through and details things that publishers do, from making sure scholarly publishers making sure that content is reliable and as correct as possible, through discoverables, so that it creates tools so that you can find pieces of information, makes it searchable, makes it reproducible, archives the information so it's around for essentially forever, and reads the trends of the publishing landscape, accommodates new models like open access, is able to disseminate that information to the widest possible audience. And so there are just so many things that scholarly publishers do that we haven't been very good about talking about and explaining to our customers and to the public. So I think we suffer from the idea that things are easy and it's just a question of putting some PDFs up on a website, and it is way more complicated. More complicated than that. And that's why it's a fascinating industry to be in, being able to work with very smart people around the world to help them communicate their discoveries and make sure that these discoveries are around so that future excellent researchers can build upon them in the future is a real privilege to be involved in that kind of work.
Awesome. Well, no, great myths to dispel, and certainly some good ones to learn from. Well, as we do wrap up this episode, if people want to reach out to you, they want to be a customer, they want to be a client, they want to be an employee, they want to be an investor, they want to be your next best friend, any or all of the above, what's the best way to reach out to you, contact you, find out more?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Devin. So I have a website, which is www.akabana consulting, AKABANA consulting.com. So that's my website. You can follow AKAB /consulting on Twitter, and we also have an Instagram account too, and of course a LinkedIn page, Akabana Consulting on LinkedIn. We'd love to. I hope maybe you'll put a chiron with the website or something there. Love to hear from anybody for discussion, for questions, and yes, if you have any problems that you'd like us to try and solve for you, we'd absolutely love to talk to you about that.
Awesome. We'll definitely encourage people to reach out, support a great business, and if nothing else, make a new best friend. So with that, thank you again, Matthew, for coming on the podcast. Been fun and been a pleasure. Now, for all of your other listeners are out there, if you can help us to share this expertise with even more startups and small businesses to help them along their journey to success, you can do so by clicking share, subscribe, and leaving us a review. Helps us to reach even more businesses and entrepreneurs. And with that, if ever you need help along your journey with patents, trademarks, or anything else with your startup or your small business, we'd love to help. Just go to strategymeeting.com. Grab some time with us to chat. And with that, thank you again, Matthew, for coming on the podcast, and wish the next leg of your journey even better than the last.
Thank you very much.